Welcome back to the Leverage Podcast, where our goal is simple: to learn from the best and discover how we can all live a better life, build a more fruitful business, and be more productive. Join us each week as we interview fellow entrepreneurs, thought leaders, and leading experts to discuss everything from marketing secrets to new technology and life as an entrepreneur.
All right, welcome back to Leverage Podcast, everyone. As always, I'm your host, Nick Sonnenberg, and today we have a really interesting episode for you. This is a bit of a departure from our normal content that we're talking about, which is usually business efficiency, process optimization. Today, we're talking about something a little more serious. Our guest is Dr. Andre Perry. We met through John Levy through his influencer dinner network. And Andre is an expert on racism in America. He's a Brookings Institute fellow, author of the book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. He's done a lot of research around how Black majority cities in America are significantly undervalued compared to white majority cities. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about in today's episode. The main idea that Andre is focused on is that the race of a neighborhood has a direct effect on housing prices. That in turn affects many other things, including the revenue of the businesses. And it means that Black people and Black neighborhoods are at a significant disadvantage from the start. Andre's done tons of research to support this, and he's incredibly knowledgeable about all the statistics around this stuff. And obviously, I like to geek out about this kind of stuff, and I had a great time getting into all the nitty-gritty nuances behind the statistics that Andre talks about and understanding how he figured them all out. I think this episode is going to be really powerful for anyone listening, but it's especially relevant for entrepreneurs, and I'll tell you why. As entrepreneurs, we're in a unique position where we can help empower people in these situations. There are a number of different market and policy-based solutions that we discuss toward the end of this episode, and I think what you'll find is that entrepreneurs are able to make a much bigger impact on these types of things than you might think. A lot of people feel like this stuff is just, out of their hands. But for us, it really isn't. There are things we can do to improve these situations, and there are also many people that are being held back from forming their own business because of these barriers. So I'm going to leave the rest of it to Andre, as he's really the expert in this area. If you want to check out the full show notes for this episode or see what Andre's up to, just head to getleverage.com/podcast, where you can find all of that and more. So let's dive into this episode.
Welcome back to the Leverage Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Sonnenberg, and today I have a very interesting and special guest, and it's very timely with everything that's going on in the world, and that is Andre Perry. He is the author of Know Your Price, a fellow at the Brookings Institute, and an expert in the area and topic of racism, diversity, and a whole bunch of other things. PhD too, right, Andre, in education?
That's right. When I want to claim it, when it's useful.
All right. Well, welcome to the show today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Nick.
So I've been reading your book. Really interesting. I heard you talk at our mutual friend, John Levy's event, and I reached out because I found it very interesting. And full disclaimer, very ignorant in this topic, right? I've never really seen racism. I have white friends. I have Black friends. So to me, hearing your talk and reading your book, some of it's just like, man, it's crazy that that's like really a thing. And it was really interesting to hear your story in the book too. So maybe you could just quickly, for the listeners, what is the book about? Why did you write it?
Well, the book is about identifying the assets, the strengths, the material goods in Black neighborhoods that are undervalued because of racism. And throughout the book, I use the word devalued to show some action, some intention on undervaluing the property. So I look at devalued assets in Black neighborhoods, but ultimately I want to uplift assets that are worthy of investment so we can drive capital to those goods and services. But the book is mainly about identifying the strength in Black community and also identifying how structural racism diminishes the value in Black communities.
And one of the points of many that you were making is you've normalized it. I think you were saying where you take two houses in equivalent kind of neighborhoods, equivalent school district quality, equivalent size of home. And you were saying that you take basically the same of two different things, but one's a white community, one's a black community. And there's like a 20-30% difference in the valuation of the house. Is that right?
Yeah. Almost correct. To really identify how much racism impacts home prices. And it's somewhat of a metaphor for life in general, but when you're talking about housing, it has real consequences on wealth. So we looked at home prices in Black neighborhoods where the share of the Black population is greater than 50%. And we compared those home prices to those homes in areas where the share of the Black population is less than 1%. So mainly all white neighborhoods. And what we found initially, without controlling for anything, just looking at straight up averages, homes in Black neighborhoods are priced about half as much as those in white neighborhoods. But people will always say that's because of education, that's because of crime, that's because of the market, that's, all these other things. But those are things you can control for in a study. So that's what I did to get an apples to apples comparison between homes and similar size, so that we controlled for size and structure. So 3,000 square foot homes with 2 bedrooms, 2 baths. We controlled for that. And then we controlled for neighborhood amenities, things like education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics you hear about. And after getting that apples to apples comparison about homes across the country in Black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods, what we found is that homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by about 23%, about $48,000 per home. Accumulatively, that's about $156 billion in lost equity. So essentially imagine us helicoptering a home in a Black neighborhood and putting it in a white one. It would, on average, increase in value by 23%, not for anything else but the race of the neighborhood.
How do you normalize it so you can do the apples to apples comparison? Like if you are normalized, so I guess crime is probably one of the key things to look at, right? So yeah. How do you measure crime? Like, is there some website or some kind of public data to look at? And then
unfortunately, it's called regression analysis. So it's a method in statistics where you can essentially get an average comparison between multiple variables. And so when I say control for, what we're essentially doing is identifying homes in similar situations. So we essentially have, I hate to get too statistical, but you have
cool. I can hang with the statistics.
You have a dependent variable of home prices, but then you have a range of independent variables. So you have everything from education, crime, walkability, all those things I talked about. And so the goal is then to say, okay, what are home prices given similar circumstances? So we just run it through a model in which you run it through the regression model. And so you can see the average after for accounting for all those different variables. So I wouldn't say normalizing as much as you're essentially identifying winnowing it down so you have very similar circumstances, removing all of these different variables. And in my case, I looked at mainly variables of personal responsibility because, you always hear people say that's because if people would take care of, education and all these different things. And by the way, I will say that education and crime do matter. They do reduce the price of the home, but it's almost as if when people are looking at homes, they see twice as much crime than there actually is, or worse education than there actually is.
My background's in statistics, I love to geek out on this stuff. So like what's like the R squared that you're seeing when you're doing that regression? Like how statistically significant is the color of someone's skin versus, is crime, for example, does that have a stronger correlation to home price versus the other factor that you're talking about, which is the color of the skin?
Well, I would say this, I would put it this way. Crime, education, these are all significant factors, right? So crime significantly drops the value of a home. Education level. So the lower the educational level, you see significant reduction in home price. So those things are significant. But what is also significant so once you account for those, there's still a 23% difference in terms of the variance. These variables like education, crime, all these things, they don't account for all of the variance.
Sure.
So the race of the neighborhood, and I want to be clear about this, the race of the neighborhood. So not necessarily the race of the owner. Obviously, you have neighborhoods in which different people own homes, and it's a pretty amazing linear phenomenon. As the concentration of Black people go up, the housing prices go down. And certainly, again, I just want to emphasize, because a lot of people misconstrue when I say the 23% difference, and they say, well, education didn't matter. Yeah, no, it does matter. In fact, when you don't control for anything, when you're just taking a straight average, homes in Black neighborhoods are priced at half as much as white neighborhoods. So straight average, just half as much. But then when you start factoring in all these other issues, it's only about 23% is left. And then you essentially monetize, you say, okay, what on average is 23%? And then you get to that 48,000 per home, and then you just aggregate it up and say that's 156 billion across the country. But each metro level is different. So I think Lynchburg is the highest, is about 85% difference. A lot of places 30-something%. There's some only 10%. And so, I recommend everyone just go to the devaluation of Black assets. Actually, there's a report. Obviously for a book, you don't put in all the methods, but I drew it from a report that my colleagues and I did. Jonathan Rothwell of Gallup, David Harshbarger of Brookings, and we did this about a year and a half ago. And so for those who want to really get into the weeds, and actually there's an interactive map on our website. So you can go to the brookings.edu to really drill down on your particular area. And this is only applies, and I didn't need to be clear, this only applies if there's enough Black people in a metro area. So
right. You have to have a statistically significant.
That's
sample,
right. So if you don't have Black people, you can't run the regression. So yeah.
Were you always doing linear regressions when you looked at this, or did you look at some non-parametric models like a classification tree to look at the interactions between factors?
Because how linear it was, it lent itself to that type of regression. But
Gotcha.
To your point, we ran multiple different models using multiple different variables because we really wanted to get a sense of, what's happening here. And so, but I wish I could show you the linearity of this thing. I mean, it was pretty straightforward. I mean, it was pretty consistent. Like, it's almost as if you're in a Black neighborhood, a few white people move in, and it's like, oh man, their housing prices start to go up. A few more white people move in, it goes up even more. And vice versa. A few Black people trickle in.
So if you generalize kind of your findings, you said 23% on average was attributed to the factor of color of skin.
Yeah, the composition of the composition of race in the neighborhood.
So what was on average the weight attributed to crime and education in that model?
Oh man, I can't remember. But again, this is one of those things where the way we controlled for it wasn't so much, if you're asking how much crime or education.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what are the
there you go. Yeah, and I can't remember in particular how much education comprises the variance of the price difference. But again, these things matter. Like, no one ever questioned that these things are playing into the price, but they don't account for all of the price difference. So that's what I'm saying. So, and again, folks can just go in and see how much And if they want to run it, they can run it. But what generally people say, and this is what we really wanted to address, is people will say almost categorically, oh, that's because of crime. That's because of education. No, I mean, those things matter. No, nobody ever says that they matter. But it's almost as if, I always say it this way, it's almost when you're looking at home prices in Black neighborhoods, people interpret, the interpretation of the data is saying that there's twice as much crime than there actually is. There's twice as much worse education than there actually is. If crime was twice as worse, or education was twice as worse, and all these other things were worse, that would be the price. But it's not on average. That there's still a significant, or the racial composition of the neighborhood is still significant. I mean, there's other factors as well. We tend to focus, like walkability matters. The number of restaurants in an area, those things matter. There's all these different factors that go into a home price. It's just that the race of the neighborhood, it amounts to a 23% difference. Given the range of variables that we've measured, all the independent variables we measured, there's still a 23% difference. You know, when people open up the report, one of the first charts, just to show the linearity of this, because you always got to start there. You always got to start with the sort of the basic relationship. And it's clear that as the race of the community becomes Blacker, the price goes down. Now, there's also historical factors. We also know that redlining, a lack of investment, all those things lead to lower home values. But again, we controlled for housing structure. We use Zillow data, which you can get a sense of quality per square foot. So we control for all of those different things. And still there's a difference. So what you can't do, what found it is almost impossible to do. And this is another way to look at it. You can't do away with race. You can't do away with education. It's not that significant. You can't do away with crime. It's still a gap. And so when people there's a wanting to just do away with race, like race doesn't matter. It just doesn't come out in the data. The data suggests that the composition of the community, not these other factors, the race of the community is a significant factor alongside other things. We did another experiment to show it the difference. We looked at businesses in Black communities. And so to get a sense of revenue and quality, we got Duns and Bradstreet data, we purchased that. But we also scraped all the Yelp data across the country for businesses to get a sense of quality. Same thing. It's sort of the same thing. But then we also controlled for neighborhood things like spending power, income, education. So we wanted, again, get an apples to apples comparison. Again, what we found is that businesses owned by people of color in Black neighborhoods, so Asian, Latino, Black, actually scored higher on Yelp, but without controlling for occupation or business type. But then when you control for business type, it's dead even, essentially dead even, no difference in quality. But they get less revenue based on the concentration of Black people in a neighborhood. So again, as the neighborhood composition of Black people go up, the revenue goes down, which suggests people are avoiding quality because of the neighborhood. Now, in those two studies alone, it taught me a lot. One, on the business side, you can easily see how the number of Yelp responses go down as a Black neighborhood goes up, as well as the revenue, which is they're getting fewer customers.
How much different is the revenue? Because
there's about a $4 billion loss.
I'm just wondering if you want to normalize it, right? So if a Black community,
but you keep saying normalizing. What do you mean by normalizing?
So, well, I like if it's I guess this is what I mean. If you have two communities and one is 20% cheaper in terms of housing prices, there's some economic impact in that area. So wouldn't you expect in any area, I'm not saying for whatever reason it is, if you take two places in the world and one is 20%, real estate's 20% less, wouldn't you find it normal that the revenue of businesses in that area should be around 20% less than
remember, we're looking at equivalent places. What we're doing with the regression is we're looking at a middle-class neighborhood with the same educational levels, and we're comparing it to a white middle-class neighborhood, same educational levels. I mean, I think what you're trying to say is, oh, they're different neighborhoods. No, but you can control, you can account for, you can find ways to look at similar neighborhoods. And that's what we're doing. When you say normalize, you're essentially, when you normalize something, you take either amounts that are different units and you try to create a consistent unit. No, what we're doing here is saying, hey, we're looking at similar homes in similar neighborhoods with similar social circumstances. And that's the difference. It's, they're different. We're not comparing a low income neighborhood in a Black neighborhood to comparing it to a high income neighborhood and saying, hey, they're the price. No, we're saying, hey, here are neighborhoods with similar educational levels, similar crime levels, similar amenities. What do they look like? All things being equal. All things being equal, except for the race of the community. Then what's the price difference?
But I guess
then there's a 23% difference.
The example you're using of the businesses having less revenue, is that a separate issue from the issue of, so you're saying that there's a 23% delta on the downside of housing prices on average in these communities? Right. So is it a separate issue that the revenue of the businesses, or is the revenue of the businesses being less in the kind of, we're comparing on the housing apples to apples, right? You had said before, similar type of area, and the only difference is Black versus white. So what I'm wondering is the reason for the revenue of the businesses being lower a separate issue, or is that driven by the first issue of the fact that of the housing, and then the housing is what is causing the revenue to be lower?
Well, the business study was a separate study because we really just wanted to look at the impact of race on revenue in general. I mean, my research is more looking about the impact of race on assets, on goods, services. And so, but with that said, there's no question that housing impacts businesses, because this is the deal. Most businesses are started by using the equity in your home. I mean, overwhelmingly. I mean, most people don't get venture capital or.
Yeah, that's my point. I'm just wondering, is it a separate issue, or is the issue really the housing, and then that trickles into these other issues of revenue of business and other things? But
for the study, there are separate studies because we just wanted to look at the ICE. But even in that paper, we say one of the reasons why there are fewer Black businesses, significantly fewer Black businesses in general, like Black people represent about 13% of the population, but only 2% of the employer businesses. The reason being, there's no question about this, is because Black people have less access to capital, principally home ownership. So you have less businesses. In addition, Black people get less startup capital. I mean, most people don't use loans to start their businesses. So only 7% of white people use loans to start their businesses. But compared to only 1% of Black businesses.
People aren't qualifying them for the loan. Is that why? Or is there a difference in loan applications between whites and Blacks?
I mean, what I'm saying is clearly this is where housing matters. Because if you have less capital, if you have less collateral, you're going to get less, you're going to qualify for less. You're going to, there's just less capital. So, so in that regard, housing, no question impacts it. And this is the other factor, is that when you have housing devaluation, when you have business devaluation, you generally have less resources in the community. Less resources in the community means less money for infrastructure, less revenue for a lot of different things. So no question these issues are related, but the studies are more focused on isolating race as a factor in how we value certain goods and services. There's a saying in the Black community that holds up, that Black elders in Black communities, if you lived in any kind of majority Black place, you will always hear the quote, "Our ice is just as cold." Because they knew that if you bypass quality in the hood, you distort the market in a way where highly rated businesses are forced to compete with lowly rated businesses. And you don't want that. You want a situation where highly rated businesses are getting more revenue. But if you're bypassing quality, and by the way, the Yelp study is really good for restaurant services. It's not so good for other kinds of goods and services. So, for that study, it's more focused on neighborhood-facing consumer businesses. But what was clear, now this is what I say as a metaphor, I'm clear there are technologists who aren't getting the love because of where their businesses are or the color of the skin of the founder. And so, yes, the Yelp study was more, it's just more people use Yelp for restaurants, for like your mechanic and things like that. So it's really focused on that, but it doesn't take long to see that between the housing study, this study, and we're actually going to get into other assets, there's a perception of risk that doesn't follow white communities, white founders. It just doesn't. So that's the part that is, we can quantify now. We can show that race does matter. And it's not one of those things, and you hear people say this all the time, oh, it's no longer race, it's class. It doesn't pan out that way. Certainly class matters, but it comes out in the wash. Like you can control for a lot of things. Race still is a significant factor.
It's really such an interesting, I don't know if interesting is the right word. It's sad that this is something that exists in the world, but I just want to make sure I understand some of the things that you said, because obviously, if A is correlated to B and B is correlated to C, that there is some correlation between A and C that's implied, right? So with the business revenue specifically, when you say that there's a decrease in revenue between the two, did you also do the study where you were looking at the correlation between housing prices to the business revenue? Because I'm just wondering if that was even more statistically significant than the race factor, and that the housing prices locally is the bigger indicator. I'm just wondering, is the housing prices a bigger or smaller factor to affecting business revenue versus race?
No. Well, again, we created a proxy for spending power one, which included housing, which included educational levels, which included the income of the neighborhood. So again, that was one of the first things we controlled for, because we wanted to get a spending power of the neighborhood in general. So you got to really control for those things. And again, just like the housing, those things matter. I'm not saying that they don't matter, but what comes out loud and clear, the race of the neighborhood is a significant factor, because this is what happens when people the question is housing more? Is education more? And it's almost like trying to do away with race. No, race matters. And to a sum of $156 billion in housing. So so that number alone, so if you take the 156 billion, that would have financed more than 4 million businesses based on the average amount Blacks use to start up their firms. It would have paid for more than 8 million four-year degrees based on the average amount of a public four-year degree. It would have replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over, covered all of Hurricane Katrina damage.
Crazy.
The reason why I say all that is what we don't want to do is say housing matters more. We're literally robbing people of a chance to start a business, to like all these different things that money represents.
Well, it's not about more. It's just, is racism affecting housing, and then housing is then the primary thing. So it's all correlated with racism at the root. But I'm just wondering, is racism a first order effect to the business stuff, or is it housing that's the first order effect, but racism is a first order effect on housing, which then is do you see what I mean? Like, I'm just wondering how the trickle effect happens here. For
me, the root, the cause, with regression, you're really trying to get at causal factors. And there's no question from my research, racism is the factor, because you don't get, without housing discrimination, without housing segregation, without bad appraisals based on race, you don't put yourself in these situations. Without the discriminatory lending practices in business and housing based on race, you don't have these problems. And so, for me, that's what we're trying to do, is to show how race causes the valuation of quality assets. And so, and much, because much of the literature kind of sidesteps race. They'll say, well, look at all these other factors. And it's like, hold up, how can you sidestep? Let's be clear, when you're talking about housing, it was legal for most of the history of the United States to discriminate against Black people. Legal, absolutely legal. The practices, the policies that were created during legal segregation. I mean, and we're not just talking about Jim Crow. The Fair Housing Act was introduced in the 60s, but you still had discriminatory housing policies well into the 70s. And then, listen, not that long ago, the housing crisis, you clearly saw, lots of studies show that Black people with similar credit scores got worse loans.
Really?
Oh, absolutely.
So you take two people, same credit score, and if just based on the color of the skin, the interest rate that they got is way worse? Worse.
Same in true business loan. The other, I encourage all your listeners to look at the New York Times story, and this is commonplace, that was just a couple of weeks ago. Abena, I'm blanking on her last name, a Black woman homeowner, married, and a white male, her husband is a white male husband, so mixed race family, got an appraisal done on the home. The first one comes in.
The wife.
The black wife there, the Black books, Black pictures on the wall, comes in, gets an appraisal. She notices it comes in very low.
What was the color of the skin of the person doing the appraisal?
White.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So, but I actually don't, I think that matters, but I also think that it's a cultural phenomenon. So
do you see if it were reversed and it was a Black appraiser and the homeowner was white, do you see the same effect or not?
No, because again, when you look at the on average, which is the market rate, so across the average, white appraisals in white neighborhoods are generally you don't see the drop. It's when you see the Black neighborhood. But I just want to go back to that example. They get another appraisal. They remove all the Black pictures, remove all the Black books. The appraisal comes in $130,000 higher.
And it was the same person that appraised, or
no, a different person.
It was a white person that did this.
Same person. But same house. Same house.
This reminds me a little bit. Did you ever see that O.J. Simpson documentary like a few years ago? I think I remember a scene when the jurors were going to go into O.J.'s house, and I believe the lawyers changed like all the pictures in the house to make him look like more white or something.
Right.
Wasn't that a scene? Yeah.
In my research, I talked to lots of families. Same thing. D.L. Hughley famously had the same thing happen to him, the comedian D.L. Hughley. Wow. But this is something that's systemic. But I don't want to see, this is what my work is about. It's about the systems. So clearly there's some systems in place. There's, if you will, sort of an algorithm that occurs that is in place that people go, oh, it's a Black person, I therefore must rate it lower. The home improvements in this Black neighborhood doesn't matter as much. There's some kind of reflexive sort of response to Blackness that reduces quality.
Separately, I'm happy to do a Zoom and we could geek out on the math side of things. I was mentioning at the beginning the non-parametric approach with the decision tree, because like an example of where that would be useful, take Vicodin and alcohol. There might be a small correlation. If you take enough Vicodin, you'll probably die. If you take enough alcohol, you'll probably die. So there's probably a small correlation between those as factors in death, but the interaction between alcohol and Vicodin, it might completely spike it. I'm wondering, if you broke out all the factors you looked at and you ran it through a decision tree, so you saw all the interactions, if it's maybe not just crime rate, but crime rate of Black people versus crime rate of white people versus average housing price. And you kind of look at it all simultaneously in a tree, what it would spit out.
But we also got to widen the aperture a little bit. That know that the wealth gap in this country is about 170 median wealth for whites compared to 17,000 median wealth for Blacks. And I'm just
is this like yearly, like how much someone makes per year, or that's total?
No, so wealth. So the total sum of your assets minus debts. So not income, wealth. So your 401ks, your home, your car, all those different things minus your debts. Mm-hmm. So the median wealth of a white family is about 170,000. Median wealth for a Black family, 17. So 10 times the difference.
10 to 1.
Now, Now that didn't occur because of, coincidence, sort of a coincidence, a flurry of the housing events, education events, all of that occurred because of policy. Remember, back in the 30s, redlining, one of the pernicious effects of redlining is that it enabled some people, low-income people, we got out of the Depression because we invested in poor people, gave them low-interest loans, down payment assistance. They moved to better neighborhoods. They used that money to uplift themselves. We just happened to limit it to white people. And those families in the 30s were able, and 40s, able to pass on that home to their children. Their children were able to pass it on to their children. Black families, on the other hand, could not take advantage of because they were redlined. The Black neighborhoods were redlined. In addition, things like the GI Bill. Black people couldn't use their GI Bill because of the racial housing covenant, so they couldn't move in. So this was deliberate. This was not like, well, let's look at this, some kind of weird cascade of events. No, the policies made it such. Now, we are still hampered by this in this regard. Wealth begets wealth. The more wealth you have, the more likely you go to college, the more likely you'll have a well-educated spouse, the more likely you'll have all these things. Yeah. In fact, we always say the opposite, like education predicts for wealth. No, wealth predicts for education. And that's why you see, and still in many different ways, white high school graduates having more wealth than Black college graduates because they had assets to work with. And so for me, we can't lose sight of the racism that started this. So we got to dismantle the structures that continue it. But this is the thing about housing. You can't wave a magic wand and say, let's increase housing prices, because you would lock out people from being able to buy the homes. And so we need new loan products. It's not so much on the West Coast, but on the Midwest and the South, there are thousands of properties priced below a level that banks won't back. So you need a new mortgage product that enables a low-income renter to buy those homes. And we need new product. We need new credit scoring systems. We need
100%. And that's not even just for white or Black. That's just in general. You could have a PhD from Harvard and used to make $1 million a year, and some event happened and you're just part of the algorithm, right? And you have to take on some debt. All of a sudden your credit score is 500. They're not looking at, your past or anything. So I think credit scoring is a problem in general.
But it's worse for people who historically have not been able to gain wealth.
Right.
That's on average. So because this is what ends up happening. One of the stories in my book, I talk about my father who was murdered in jail. It's not like I didn't crumble. I'm obviously here. I'm at the Brookings Institution. I'm doing wonderful things. But if you ask me, did I own a home right out of the box? No. Did I have to take out loans to get all my education? Absolutely. Did I have to do a lot of things that some of my colleagues did not? And even my son. So my son, will he have, my older daughter, does she have to take out loans? No, she does not. Her credit score is, pristine because she had parents who can essentially be her financier, so she doesn't have to take out. So, and that just is a position of many Black and brown Americans, because they just were not able, they were prohibited from gaining the kind of wealth. And so we always, and that's what my research really ultimately gets at. I want to build wealth in areas. And so we got to correct for devaluation. Can I just say one thing, just to your listeners, because there's an opportunity here. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I'm working with the Ashoka organization. I don't know if folks are familiar with Ashoka. It's a social entrepreneurship organization. We'll be giving away $1 million in prize money to organizations and firms who have solutions to devaluation, because this is a complicated issue. Like I said, you can't wave a magic wand and say raise housing prices. You got to figure out ways to restore value to communities and actually invest in people. And so for all those entrepreneurs out there who want to work on this issue, pay attention. You can always follow me at Andre Perry EDU on Twitter and Instagram. And so we're going to roll out this announcement. Ashoka, we believe that solutions can come from the local communities. And so we are looking for entrepreneurs who are passionate about these issues, and we're going to incentivize them to work on the issue.
I think that's a wonderful, wonderful thing that you're doing there. One thing I'm wondering is, I used to be a high frequency trader, so I always have my trader hat on. If there's such a mispricing or undervaluing of these assets, right? Sounds like there's an opportunity. Have you thought about raising a fund and taking advantage of this? And you tell me, but has the problem over time, so there's a problem, and you've done the analysis. If you were to have done the analysis a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, was it even worse? Is the trend of this issue getting better? In which case, is there a financial opportunity to raise a fund and you invest in these places with the prediction that in 10 years, you're going to make a killing.
Developers have been doing that because this is the issue. If you're wealthy, you're getting a 23% discount. That 23, it's a discount. And so developers essentially buy up properties. And so for me, this is why I say we need market-based solutions and policy solutions, because what you're describing is what people call opportunity zones. That you see areas now, many opportunity zones are not low income. That's one of the problems with the initiative. But yes, we want to create incentives to invest in communities. But this is the issue. If you invest in place and not people, you essentially make matters worse, because you'll raise property prices and people in local communities won't keep pace, and then they get pushed out. So the trick is you got to figure out ways to restore value to communities iteratively, but also empowering the people in the communities. I mean, I always bring up the Depression for this reason. We didn't say don't invest or invest in place and not people when the Depression hit. We gave checks to individuals. We gave low interest home loans, good debt. We gave them good debt. And we gave them down payment assistance. And guess what happened? We got out of the Depression. New neighborhoods were created. Life was good, but we just excluded Black people from the process. We can do the same thing today. We can identify people, say, like if we can't use race because of legal issues, why not say if your grandfather did not own a home? Why can't you qualify for that fund to purchase a property in a particular area? Now that is possible, but we always got to make sure that you invest in the person, because right now a lot of the funds that are set up to invest in neighborhoods are really investing in brick and mortar.
Right. And then it could hurt the problem you're saying, right? Because you push the property prices up in these areas, and then in 5 years you've pushed out kind of all the people and you have new people in.
Let's talk about Oakland. Let's talk about DC. Let's talk about lots of places where that occurred naturally, where you had clearly people saw an opportunity and they said, hey, I'll invest here. I'll do this and that. People push that.
Harlem's gotten much nicer, in the last 5-10 years. Has that happened as well there, where people have gotten pushed out?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, Harlem, it was years ago when Bill Clinton moved in. It was like, oh, it's a different Harlem. Now, again, you would never hear me say, don't invest in place. I would never say that. Invest in place, improve the place, but invest in people as well. It can be done. And so that's why we're having this Ashoka competition, because we really do want people to come up with innovative solutions that maintains community, improves upon it, and gives people opportunity. As we talked about, we're talking about generational wealth, that we want to see people pass on assets to their children and their children down the road.
Has it ever been brought up or an idea been thrown out where, if you live in one of these areas, you don't get a tax credit or discount or anything like that, but you get some type of scholarship or some discount on going to college if you live in a certain area. So then there's some financial incentive, but it's being passed into, the education system, the financial incentive.
Well, the reason why I focus on housing, because remember, home prices also determine the taxes that municipalities collect to fund things like education, infrastructure, policing, things like that. Lots of people propose ways to address this problem. That's one of the reparation ideas, to provide educational opportunities in the form of scholarships and things like that. Now, which I would always say that's good, but you also need, because why it's good is that you're essentially getting rid of non-collateralized debt. So you want to get rid of those kind of things. You want to get rid of hospital bills. student loans, obviously credit card bills. Those are kind of the bad debt you don't want. But you do want mortgages. You want a business loan. Those are the kind of things that you can leverage for wealth. Most people don't inherit their wealth. They almost have to take on a loan to establish wealth. I mean, most people don't get some a venture capitalist to invest in them. I mean, most people don't. Most people need to take out some form of a loan. And so you do want people to take on debt. You just want them to take on good debt and remove bad debt. And so, I mean, I would not be opposed to getting rid of bad debt, but I'm also strongly in favor of making people have the ability to build wealth. And so eliminating debt, just one half of the wealth equation, won't be enough to build wealth. Eventually, you need capital that you can build upon to gain wealth.
Andre, I want to be respectful of your time. This has been awesome. I want to continue the conversation.
Yeah.
Where can people find out more? Check out your book, Know Your Price. Awesome book.
Know Your Price.
Where else could people find out more about you? You mentioned Twitter before.
Twitter, Andre Perry EDU is Twitter, IG. Obviously, sign up for the Brookings newsletter. I produce a lot of reports on this topic. And in fact, look out for a bunch of studies actually on business valuations, other things, land use. But follow me on Twitter, look out for me on Brookings, and see me in these streets. I'm in these streets, so look for me.
I'll be on the lookout, man. Well, great chatting, and let's do this again soon.
All right, thanks a lot.
I hope that this was as eye-opening for you as it was for me, because this is a really serious problem throughout America. And I hope that as entrepreneurs, we all keep this in mind and use our businesses and our roles to help fix these problems in our society. I want to extend a big thank you to Andre Perry for not only coming on the show, but for answering all my nitty-gritty statistical questions. Figuring out all the nuances behind those numbers was fun for me and helped me get a better understanding of what's going on. And I hope it did the same for you. If you want to check out what Andre is doing or get involved with some of the initiatives he's working on, you can look him up on the Brookings Institute website or follow him on Twitter at Andre Perry EDU. That's AndrePerry.edu. And if you found this episode interesting, you'll definitely want to check out his book, which is called Know Your Price: Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. You can find all that in the show notes for this episode at getleverage.com/podcast. And finally, if you've made it this far and you haven't already downloaded our guide to remote communication, I don't know what you're waiting for. Just head over to getleverage.com/podcast, click on the show notes for this episode. You'll find a link and you can download it right away. It's a quick read and it'll give you the foundation for super efficient remote communication systems for your business. I always say that a business can only grow as fast as information can be retrieved, not transferred. And setting up proper communication systems is the first step in getting there. And as always, if you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to leave us a rating and subscribe to the podcast. It really helps us out, and we do appreciate every rating and subscription. See you on the next episode.